The bells rang for another woman's wedding, but for Willa Mayhart, they were a death knell. Each chime that echoed through the frostbitten town of Redemption was another shovel of dirt on the grave of her old life. Her mother was gone, buried just a week before in a coat Willa now wore, a coat that smelled of pine soap and lingering sickness. It hung on her like a sin, too big, too worn, a constant reminder of everything she had lost. She stood outside the general store, her breath a ghost in the air. Inside, the townspeople laughed, warm and safe. They had food. They had futures. Willa had 3 jars of pickled peaches and a tin of biscuits that were already going stale. She didn't look back at the church. There was nothing for her there but judgment, served cold. The whispers followed her anyway, sharp as splintered ice. Her mother was too soft. That girl won't last the winter. They were probably right. Her boots slipped on the icy path to the sheriff's office. The parcel in her arms felt impossibly heavy, like it contained the full weight of her desperation. She pushed the door open, and a wave of stale heat hit her face. Sheriff Amos Pike sat behind his desk, a man carved from oak and suspicion. He was too old to be chasing bandits and too proud to admit it. His eyes, narrowed under a graying brow, flicked down to the parcel she clutched like a prayer. He grunted, a sound like grinding stones. "That all you're offering?" Willa's voice was a dry rustle, but it didn't break. "I need flour, Sheriff, and salt. The store won't trade with me." "I know," he said, and the words held no pity. He scratched at his grizzled beard, his chair groaning as he leaned back, studying her. He looked at her not like a person, but like a problem he didn't want. "There's a man," he said finally, his voice low. "Lives out by the cursed ridge. Apache. Name of Chessa." Willa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the snow outside. Everyone knew about the man on the ridge. A phantom. A savage, they called him. A ghost who lived where decent folk wouldn't dare tread. "He hunted 2 deer," Pike continued, his eyes fixed on her. "He's got meat to spare, but he don't eat preserves." He leaned forward, his gaze hardening. "He might trade, if you go yourself." The room suddenly felt small, the air thick and suffocating. "You want me to ride up that pass? In this snow?" "Snow's not heavy yet," Pike said, waving a dismissive hand. "But it's coming, a real monster of a storm. You'll make it if you leave now." He paused, and a strange, unreadable glint entered his eye. "Or you won't." She stared at him, the unspoken words hanging between them. He wasn't offering her a chance. He was offering her an exile. He was washing his hands of her, sending her into the teeth of a blizzard to a man the town considered less than human. It was a death sentence, gift-wrapped as a last resort. But when you're down to trading your mother's peaches for a cup of flour, you don't have the luxury of pride. Your pride is already buried 6 feet under, right next to your mother. Willa gave a single sharp nod, and that was that. Outside, her old horse, Ginny, waited with the patience of the damned. She loaded the parcel onto the sway-backed mare and pulled herself up, the cold seeping instantly through the thin fabric of her skirt. The wind coiled around her, a living thing with cruel intentions. No one in town watched her leave, but she felt their eyes. She felt them peering from behind their clean curtains, their lips moving in silent, smug pronouncements. "There goes the last of the Mayharts, gone to the devil on the mountain." She didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. She aimed Ginny's nose toward the looming, black-toothed mountains and rode straight into the coming storm. The trail that led out of Redemption wasn't just a path, it was a choice. And Willa was beginning to suspect she had just made a terrible one. The world dissolved into a fury of white. The trail up the ridge vanished first, swallowed by a thick, relentless snow that fell not in flakes, but in blinding sheets. Willa was forced to dismount, her boots sinking to her knees in the freezing powder. She led Ginny by the reins, her body bent against a wind that screamed like a banshee. The pines loomed over her like skeletal giants, their branches heavy with ice, groaning under the weight. Every breath was a shard of glass in her lungs. Her hope, which had started as a tiny flickering ember, was now nothing but cold ash. The sheriff hadn't been sending her to trade. He'd been sending her to die. Just as her legs began to tremble uncontrollably, just as the thought of lying down in the snow began to feel like a warm invitation, she saw it. Through the swirling chaos, a weak, yellow light. A cabin, built low and stout against the slope of the mountain, smoke twisting from its chimney in a defiant gray column. It was real. He was real. Her knuckles were completely numb by the time she reached the heavy oak door. She knocked once, twice, the sound swallowed by the howling wind. She wasn't sure if anyone could even hear her over the storm's rage. She was about to knock again when the door swung inward, and the world stopped. He filled the entire frame. He had to duck to keep from hitting his head. Chessa. He was bigger than any man she'd ever seen, his shoulders so broad they blocked out the firelight from behind him, casting him in terrifying silhouette. His arms, bare despite the cold, were crossed over a powerful chest, the muscles corded like thick ropes. His skin was the color of rich river clay, and his black hair, streaked with snowflakes, hung loose past his collarbones. But it was his eyes that stole her breath. They were dark as coal, buried in a face that looked like it had been carved from the mountain itself. And those eyes were scanning her, from her worn-out boots to the tip of her frozen braid, with an intensity that stripped her bare. He was silent for a long moment, the storm raging around them. Then he spoke, his voice low and even, a rumble that seemed to come from the very center of the earth. "You're smaller than I expected," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Sheriff Pike said he was sending me a sturdy woman." Willa's face, already numb with cold, burned with a sudden fierce heat. Shame, humiliation. He was expecting someone else. A mail-order bride? A woman sent to be his wife? The sheriff hadn't just sent her to trade. He had traded her. She took a clumsy step back, her legs screaming in protest. "I can leave." But she couldn't. The wind shrieked, a physical blow that nearly knocked her off her feet. A distant crack of thunder echoed through the peaks, a promise that the storm was settling in for a long, deadly siege. There was no leaving. There was no trail. There was only this man, this mountain, and the terrible, suffocating truth of her situation. He didn't answer right away. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. It felt like he was measuring her, not her size, but the depth of her silence, the fight left in her soul. Then, without another word, he moved aside, opening a path into the warmth of the cabin. "You'll freeze before you reach the bend," he said. It wasn't an invitation. It was a fact. She hesitated for a heartbeat, her mind racing. Was this a cage or a sanctuary? A predator or a protector? In the end, it didn't matter. Freezing to death was a certainty. Whatever lay inside that cabin was, at least, a chance. Willa crossed the threshold. The warmth hit her like a physical blow, an embrace she hadn't earned and didn't trust. The cabin was dim, lit only by the flickering fire in the stone hearth. Pine walls, a simple cot in the corner, thick animal pelts hanging from the rafters to dry. A pot simmered on a small stove, and the smell of roasting venison, juniper, and sage filled the air, making her stomach clench with a hunger so sharp it was painful. She stood awkwardly in the center of the small room, still clutching the parcel of peaches and biscuits like a shield. He closed the heavy door behind her, shutting out the storm. The silence that fell was more deafening than the wind had been. He pointed a chin toward a low bench near the fire. "Sit. You're shaking." "I'm not," she lied, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the words. "You are," he stated, turning away from her. He took the parcel from her trembling hands, his touch surprisingly gentle. He unwrapped the cloth, looked at the 3 jars and the tin of biscuits without comment, and set them on a small table. Then he did something that completely baffled her. He moved to the stove, ladled a generous portion of the rich, steaming stew into a tin bowl, added 2 thick slices of hard bread from a cloth-wrapped loaf, and set it on the bench in front of her. "You'll eat," he said. Again, not a request, a command. She stared at the food, her mind reeling. Was this part of the trade? A down payment for the woman he thought he was getting? Her pride, battered as it was, bristled. She wasn't some piece of property to be fattened up. When she didn't move, he didn't press. He simply turned his back on her and went to tend the fire, splitting more kindling with a few practiced swings of a small hatchet. The message was clear. Her pride could starve, but her body didn't have to. Only then, when he wasn't looking, did she begin to eat. She started slow, her mouth dry, but the first taste of hot meat and broth sent a shockwave through her system. She hadn't tasted real food in days. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the spoon, but she ate until the bowl was empty, until the warmth spread from her belly through her entire frozen body. She set the empty bowl aside and tucked her hands into her coat sleeves, watching him. The room was quiet. Not an empty quiet, but a still one, filled with the crackle of the fire and the sound of his steady work. "You live here alone?" she asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. She just needed to fill the silence, to prove she still had a voice. He didn't turn around. "I live where I'm not hunted." The simple, brutal honesty of it silenced her. She lowered her gaze, staring into the flames. "I'm Willa," she whispered, not sure if he could even hear her. "Willa Mayhart." He turned at last, his dark eyes finding hers across the flickering space. He gave a single, slow nod. Chessa. The way he said his name, it held weight. It was more than a word. It was a statement of existence, a claim on this small patch of the world that hated him. Just then, a furious gust of wind slapped against the shutters, and a hiss of driven snow sprayed against the walls. The storm had come in full. There was no escape. "You won't ride out tonight," Chessa said, his voice flat. "The trail's gone." He gestured toward the cot. "You can take that." "No," she said, too quickly. "It's yours. I'll sleep by the fire." He raised a single, dark eyebrow, a flicker of something. Amusement? Surprise? In his eyes. But he didn't argue. Instead, he took a thick, heavy bearskin pelt from the wall and laid it out on the floorboards near the hearth. He then grabbed a second, smaller one and handed it to her. She curled beneath the fur, facing the fire, the heat of the stew a comforting weight inside her. She was a stranger in a dangerous man's cabin, trapped by a blizzard, sold by her own town. But she was warm, she was fed, she was for the moment alive. Somewhere in the haze between sleep and sorrow, she heard herself whisper to the fire, "I don't take up much room. I know that." Chessa didn't reply for a long time. The only sounds were the fire and the storm. She thought he hadn't heard her, or perhaps had just chosen to ignore her. But then his low voice cut through the quiet, and his words wrapped around her like another blanket. "A small fire," he said, "still keeps a soul alive." Willa blinked, her eyes stinging. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the world was buried in a deep and total hush. And inside, where the town's judgment could not reach, something old and frozen within her, something she hadn't even realized was there, began to thaw. The storm raged for 3 solid days. The world beyond the cabin ceased to exist, erased by a canvas of impenetrable white. The windows became frosted over, turning the dim interior into a timeless cocoon. For Willa, time was now measured not by the sun, but by the rhythm of survival, the stoking of the fire, the brewing of coffee, the shared silent meals. On the second morning, she woke stiff and sore to the smell of coffee already brewing. Chessa was moving about the cabin, his presence a quiet, constant hum. He didn't greet her with words, but he passed her a hot tin cup, and their fingers brushed. It was a small, fleeting contact, but in the profound silence of their world, it felt as loud as a shout. Neither of them pulled away. The quiet between them had changed. It was no longer the tense, awkward silence of 2 strangers. It had gained weight, a substance. It was like the heavy, peaceful silence of a forest after a fresh snowfall. She watched him as he worked. He moved with an economy of motion, a grace that seemed at odds with his immense size. He sharpened knives, sorted dried herbs into leather pouches, checked the snares hanging by the door. He did each task with a focused intention, as if it were the most important thing in the world. His steadiness was a balm to her frayed nerves. It made her feel less like a prisoner and more like a guest. "No shame in learning," he said, when she fumbled while trying to help him stack kindling. The words were delivered so gently they startled her. There was no judgment in his voice, no pity, just a simple statement of fact. She looked at him then, truly looked. She saw the fine, faded scar that traced a line from his temple into his hairline. She saw the deep lines around his eyes, not from anger, but from years of squinting into the sun and wind. Those eyes, which had first seemed so hard and intimidating, held no cruelty. They held a deep, profound weariness, and something else, a stillness. "Why?" she asked later that day, her voice barely a whisper. They were sitting near the door, a sack of root vegetables between them. "Why do you live all the way up here? All alone?" He took his time answering, carefully peeling a tough winter carrot with his knife. Finally he looked up, his gaze meeting hers. "To be alone," he said, "is safer than to be misunderstood." Willa felt a pang of recognition. "My mother used to say that folks in town like to build monsters, so they have a place to bury their guilt." Chesa stopped his work. He looked at her for a long, long time, a silent conversation passing between them. "Your mother was a wise woman," he said at last. Willa swallowed against the lump forming in her throat. "She died last week. Consumption." "I am sorry," he said. The words were plain, unadorned, but they were the first truly soft thing he had said to her. They were a gift, and she held them close. That evening, the storm showed its first sign of breaking. A sliver of moon appeared through a gap in the clouds, casting a pale, ethereal light onto the snow-covered world. The wind died down to a low moan. Willa was mending a tear in her sleeve by the firelight, her fingers clumsy with the needle. Chesa sat across from her, whittling a small block of cedar wood. The only sounds were the pop of the fire and the soft scrape of his knife against the wood. "Do you miss them?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Your people?" "Yes," he said simply, not looking up from his work. "Every day." He paused, turning the block of wood in his large hands. "But to miss them is to remember them, and to remember them is to keep them with me. They are not gone. They just walk in a different forest now." She didn't ask more. She didn't need to. She understood that his silence wasn't empty. It was full of ghosts, of memories, of a life she could never comprehend, a life that had been stolen from him. Later that night, she woke from a dream, her cheeks wet with tears. She had dreamt of her mother, of the smell of baking bread and the sound of her humming. A wave of grief, so powerful it was physical, washed over her. She sat up, gasping for breath, her hands clenched in the bearskin pelt. She didn't expect him to be awake, but he was. He was sitting in the shadows near the door, his back against the wall, a knife resting in his hand. He wasn't sleeping. He was watching, guarding. "I'm fine," she whispered into the darkness, her voice thick with unshed tears. He gave a single nod, saying nothing. But he rose, stoked the fire until it burned brighter, and placed the kettle near the embers. He passed it to her before she even had to ask, a silent offering of comfort that meant more than 1,000 empty words. In that small, quiet moment, a thread was woven between them, not of love, not of passion, but of something far rarer: understanding. The next morning, the world was transformed. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of breathtaking, pristine beauty. The sun shone with a blinding intensity, reflecting off a sea of untouched snow. It was a new world, a clean slate. "I want to help," Willa announced, her voice firm. With the traps. He hesitated for only a second before handing her a pair of thick fur-lined gloves and a heavy wool scarf. They walked out into the glittering morning, their steps the first to mar the perfect snow. The silence of the forest was absolute, broken only by the crunch of their boots and the distant groan of a snow-laden branch. At the first trap, a rabbit lay still and warm. Chessa knelt, his head bowed. He whispered something in his own language, a soft, lyrical string of words that sounded like a prayer. "It is a thank you," he explained when he saw her watching, "for its life, to ensure its spirit travels unburdened." He then showed her how to reset the delicate mechanism, his large, sure hands guiding her smaller, fumbling ones. He handed her the animal to carry. She flinched, but she took it. Blood was a part of life out here. So was taking only what you needed. On the walk back, he didn't offer to carry the burden for her. He let her carry it herself. He trusted her to be strong enough. That evening, Willa lit the fire. It caught on the first try, the flames leaping up with a cheerful roar. She looked up to see Chessa watching her, a faint, almost imperceptible curve at the edge of his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. "You have a strong spirit," he said. "Most folks in town would say I'm weak," she murmured, her eyes on the flames. "Most folks," he replied, his voice a low rumble, "don't know the difference between a loud voice and a strong heart." They sat closer that night, not touching, but near enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She asked him about the small figure he was always carving. Without a word, he turned the block of cedar in his hand, showing it to her in the firelight. It was the figure of a woman, small, with a strong chin, and a long braid running down her back. The carving wasn't beautiful or delicate. It was solid, grounded. It looked familiar. "She's not very pretty," Willa said, her voice catching in her throat. "She is not meant to be pretty," Chessa replied, his dark eyes meeting hers. "She is meant to stand, to endure." The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Willa quickly turned back to the mending in her lap, trying to hide the sudden quiver of her lip. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm, a silent dance of shared existence. She learned the groan of the floorboards, the particular way the wind whistled through the eaves. He learned the sound of her humming as she cooked, a quiet, tentative melody that had been absent for a very long time. Their hands brushed as they both reached for the same pan, and this time it was Willa who didn't pull away. One morning she found the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her. "Do you hate them, the people in town, for what they say about you, for what they did to your people?" He was sharpening a long hunting knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic shing 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 a steady counterpoint to her trembling heart. He didn't stop. "Hate is a fire that burns the one who carries it," he said, his eyes focused on the blade. "I used to carry it. It made my pack heavy. Now I carry the mountains instead. They are still heavy, but they are mine. They do not burn me from the inside out." She closed her eyes, the truth of his words settling deep in her soul. "I think I'm tired," she said, so softly she wasn't sure if she'd spoken aloud. "Tired of being small, tired of being pitied and looked over." He stopped his work. The sudden silence was profound. He wiped the blade clean on a piece of leather, his movements deliberate. Then he held out the small, carved figure of the woman. "For you," he said. She took it, her breath catching in her chest. She held it in the palm of her hand. It felt warm, alive. You carved me." He shook his head, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "No, I carved the woman I hoped would come to my mountain." She looked up then, into those dark, steady eyes that had seen so much pain but held no malice, and in their depths she saw not a reflection of the small, scared girl who had stumbled up this mountain, but the woman she was becoming. Outside, a new sound filled the air, a soft, steady dripping. The icicles on the eaves were weeping. The snow was beginning to melt. Spring wasn't here yet, but it was thinking about it. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, so was Willa. But the thaw brought more than just the promise of spring. It brought back the world. A week later, the trail down the mountain was a treacherous mess of mud and melting snow, but it was passable. Willa knew she couldn't stay hidden on the ridge forever. She had to face the town. She had to see if her little house was still standing, if there was anything left of her old life worth salvaging. "I have to go back," she told Chessa one morning, her voice more resolute than she felt. "Just for a day, to check on my house, and to see an old friend." Chessa didn't argue. He simply nodded, his face an unreadable mask. He packed her a small satchel with dried meat and a water skin. "The creek will be high," was all he said. "If the pass floods, you wait it out. Don't be a fool." She rode old Ginny down the mountain, and with every step away from the cabin, a knot of dread tightened in her stomach. The town, when it finally came into view, looked smaller than she remembered, and meaner. The houses seemed to hunch together, their windows like suspicious eyes. She hadn't been in town for more than 5 minutes before the whispers started. She tethered Ginny near the chapel and walked toward the general store, her patched coat feeling like a beggar's rags. Heads turned. Conversations stopped, mid-sentence. Tess Rollins, the woman whose wedding bells had been the soundtrack to Willa's despair, stood in the doorway of the bakery. She was surrounded by a gaggle of women in clean bonnets and thin smiles. "Well, well," Tess said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look what the storm coughed up." Willa kept her eyes straight ahead, her jaw tight. She just needed salt, matches, and needles. That was all. "You smell of smoke, Willa," Tess called after her, a cruel lilt in her voice. "Is that what happens when you shack up with a red-skinned savage?" That stopped her. The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Willa turned slowly, her heart pounding, but her face was a calm mask. She met Tess's smug gaze. "I was warm," Willa said, her voice quiet but carrying in the sudden silence. "And I was safe." She held Tess's eyes for a beat longer. "Can you say the same in your pretty new house, Tess?" A flicker of shock, then rage, crossed Tess's face. Before she could retort, Willa turned and continued on her way. But the victory felt hollow. Inside, an old wound had been ripped open. She found her friend Agnes, a woman whose face was a road map of 80 hard winters, sitting on her porch. Agnes's eyes, though clouded with age, were sharp as ever. "You didn't freeze," Agnes stated, patting the spot beside her. "No, ma'am," Willa said, sinking onto the bench. "Town's been talking," Agnes said, not unkindly. "They're saying you've been keeping company with the Apache." "I've been surviving," Willa corrected her gently. Agnes looked at her, a long, searching look. "Was he kind to you, child?" Willa thought of the hot stew, the extra pelt, the silent way he guarded her while she slept. "He didn't speak much," she said, her voice thick, "but his silence was kind." Agnes nodded slowly, a deep satisfaction in her eyes. "Sometimes, that's worth more than 100 pretty words and a cold bed." Willa's house was still standing, but it felt cold and empty, haunted by the ghost of her mother. The windows had been boarded up by neighbors, more to hide their own guilt than to protect her property. She found the quilt her mother had been stitching before she died, the needle still stuck in a faded rose pattern. Willa wrapped it around her shoulders, the worn fabric a fragile shield against the world's cruelty. As she was leaving town, a new, more dangerous obstacle appeared. A crowd had gathered in the square. In the center stood Sheriff Pike, his arms crossed. Flanking him were 3 men Willa had never seen before, ranch hands by the look of them, with hard eyes and cruel mouths. And then she saw him. Elam Kerr, a man whose brother had been killed in a skirmish with an Apache raiding party years ago. A man whose heart was a shriveled knot of pure, unadulterated hatred. Pike saw her. His face was grim. "Willa," he said, his voice flat. "We've been hearing things." "I'm sure you have, Sheriff," she replied, her hand tightening on Ginny's reins. Elam Kerr stepped forward, his eyes boring into her. "Folks are saying you spent the storm up on the ridge. With him. I wasn't alone if that's what you're asking, Willa said, her voice steady. One of the ranch hands snickered. Yeah, that's the problem, ain't it? Pike shot the man a warning look, then lowered his voice, speaking to Willa alone. This town has a long memory, Willa, and it ain't a forgiving one. They don't understand, and what they don't understand, they destroy. I'm not asking for their understanding, she said, her chin held high. Then you best keep riding, he warned, and don't look back. But Tess Rollins wasn't finished with her. She stepped out from the crowd, her face a mask of triumphant spite. You think you're so strong now, don't you? She hissed. Hiding in a shack with that savage. He'll leave you, you know, or worse. They always do. He is a better man than anyone in this town, Willa said, the words clear and true. She swung herself up onto Ginny's back. The precious quilt clutched around her. She looked down at the sea of hostile faces, at Tess's twisted smile, at Elam Kerr's burning hatred, at Sheriff Pike's weary resignation. And she made her choice. She turned Ginny not away from the mountain, but back toward it, back toward the cabin, back home. As she rode away, she didn't know that her defiance had been the spark. She didn't know that Elam Kerr was already gathering men, his heart set on vengeance. She didn't know that the fragile peace she had found was about to be shattered. She only knew that she was riding toward the one place in the world where she felt safe, and she would protect it, and the man who lived there, with her very last breath. The climb back up the mountain felt different. Before, she had been climbing toward an unknown terror. Now, she was climbing toward the only solace she had ever known. The air grew cleaner, the scent of pine washing away the stink of the town's prejudice. When the cabin came into view, a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees washed over her. Chesa was there, standing on the stoop, as if he had been waiting for her. He didn't smile, but his eyes followed her every move as she dismounted, his presence a silent, solid anchor in her turbulent world. You stayed long, he said, his voice a low rumble. They wanted me to be ashamed, she answered, sliding off Ginny's back. He took the horse's reins from her hand, his gaze searching her face. And were you? No, she said, meeting his eyes. I wasn't. He simply nodded, and in that small gesture, she felt a profound sense of validation. He led Ginny to a small lean-to, while Willa went inside. The cabin welcomed her with its familiar scent of wood smoke and sage. She laid her mother's quilt over the cot, smoothing the worn fabric with a loving hand. It looked right there. That night, they shared a tea brewed from pine tips and mint. He asked no questions about her time in town, and she offered no stories. She didn't need to. The tense set of her shoulders, the defiant glint in her eye, told him everything. As the fire burned low, she did something she had never dared to do before. She picked up her mother's quilt, walked over to where he sat, and draped it over both their shoulders. It was a simple, intimate gesture, a sharing of the last, most precious thing she owned. He stiffened for a moment, surprised, but he did not pull away. They sat there in silence, sharing the warmth of the fire and the quilt, a silent testament to their unspoken bond. But peace, Willa was learning, was a fragile thing. 2 days later, the sound came. It was faint at first, a distant thrumming that was not the wind. Chesa, who had been skinning a rabbit by the door, froze. He lifted his head, his nostrils flaring, his body tensed like a coiled spring. Riders, he said, his voice a low growl. Many of them. Willa's blood ran cold. Are you sure? The mountain told me, he said, and she did not doubt him. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. You have to hide, she urged, her voice trembling. They're coming for you, because of me. They are coming for what they fear, he corrected her, his voice calm and steady, and I do not hide from fearful men. He rose to his full, formidable height, his face set like stone. I will meet them. No, Willa said, her fear suddenly replaced by a fierce, protective rage. "We will meet them." She grabbed the heaviest iron poker from the hearth, its weight a comforting reality in her hand. She stood beside him at the door of the cabin, her small frame a stark contrast to his towering one. They stood together, a silent, defiant front. They didn't have to wait long. The riders broke through the tree line, a posse of a dozen men, their faces grim and determined. Elam Kerr was at their head, his face a mask of righteous fury, and beside him, to Willa's horror, was Sheriff Pike. "Chessa!" Kerr bellowed, his voice echoing through the clearing. "Send out the white woman, this doesn't concern her." "Everything that happens on this mountain concerns me," Willa called back, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. Kerr's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in contempt. "You've been bewitched by him, girl. Step aside before you get hurt." "The only person who has ever hurt me is you, Elam Kerr," she retorted. "You and your town full of whispers and hate." A low murmur went through the posse. Some of the men shifted uncomfortably on their horses, but Kerr's hatred was a fire that could not be quenched. "That's enough," he roared, swinging down from his horse. "We're taking him in, for trial." "For what crime?" Chessa asked, his voice calm and powerful, cutting through Kerr's bluster. "For defiling a good Christian woman," Kerr spat. Willa stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "He did not defile me. He saved me. He showed me more kindness in a week than this whole town has shown me in a lifetime." Sheriff Pike, who had been silent until now, finally spoke, his voice heavy with weariness. "Willa, son, just come on down. Let's sort this out peacefully." "There is no peace with him," Kerr snarled, gesturing to Chessa. He took a step forward, his hand dropping to the butt of the pistol on his hip. And that's when everything exploded. Chessa moved with a speed that was terrifying, a blur of motion. He didn't wait for Kerr to draw. He closed the distance in 2 long strides, his hand shooting out not for a weapon, but for Kerr's wrist. There was a sickening crack of bone, and Kerr screamed, his pistol clattering to the ground. 2 of Kerr's men lunged forward, but Willa was ready. She swung the heavy iron poker with all her might, catching the first man squarely on the knee. He howled and collapsed. The clearing erupted into chaos. It wasn't a fight. It was a desperate, brutal brawl. Chessa moved among the men like a force of nature, his powerful fists and feet a whirlwind of controlled violence. He wasn't trying to kill them, he was disabling them, breaking them, with a cold, terrifying efficiency. Willa fought like a cornered animal, swinging the poker, kicking, biting, her fear a hot metallic taste in her mouth. She was knocked to the ground, a rough hand grabbing her hair, and for a terrifying moment, she thought it was over. Then a shot rang out. Not a pistol, but a rifle, loud, authoritative. Everyone froze. Sheriff Pike stood by his horse, his rifle raised, a thin curl of smoke rising from the barrel. He hadn't shot at anyone, he had fired into the air. "That's enough!" he roared, and this time his voice held the iron of true command. "All of you, stand down, now!" The fight bled out of the men. They stood panting, bruised and broken, staring at the sheriff. Elam Kerr was on the ground, clutching his shattered wrist, his face pale with pain and shock. Pike dismounted, his eyes sweeping over the scene. He looked at the injured men, then at Willa, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes blazing with defiance. Then he looked at Chessa, who stood tall and unbowed amidst the carnage, his chest heaving, his body a testament to his controlled power. "I told you to leave it be, Elam," Pike said, his voice dangerously quiet. "He's a savage, Amos," Kerr gasped. "He broke my arm." "You came to his home with a dozen armed men," Pike retorted. "You're lucky he didn't break your neck." He turned to the rest of the posse. "Get him and get out of here, and if I ever see any of you on this ridge again, I won't be firing into the air. That's a promise." The men, defeated and shamed, gathered up their injured and retreated, their threats and curses swallowed by the silent trees. Soon only Willa, Chessa, and the sheriff remained. Pike sighed, a long, weary sound. He looked at Willa. "You all right, girl?" "I am now," she said, her voice shaking slightly. He nodded, then turned his gaze to Chessa. A long, silent moment passed between the two men, a look of grudging respect in the sheriff's eyes. Heard a story once, Pike said, more to himself than to them, about an Apache warrior who dragged a wounded lawman 10 miles through a blizzard to save his life. Never knew if it was true. Chessa remained silent, his expression unchanging. Guess it is, Pike said with a final nod. He tipped his hat. You too? You try and stay out of trouble. With that, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving them in the quiet aftermath. The clearing was a mess of trampled snow and scuffed earth. Willa's adrenaline faded, leaving her trembling and exhausted. She looked at Chessa. He had a cut on his cheek and his knuckles were raw and bloody, but he stood as solid and immovable as the mountain itself. He looked at her, at the iron poker still clutched in her hand, at the fierce, unwavering loyalty in her eyes. He reached out, his hand gently taking the poker from her grasp and setting it aside. Then, his calloused fingers lightly touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a smudge of dirt. It was the first time he had ever touched her with such deliberate tenderness. A small fire, he said, his voice a low, soft rumble, repeating the words he had spoken to her on that first, terrifying night. But it keeps a soul alive, she finished for him, a tear tracing a clean path through the grime on her face. He didn't smile, but his eyes, dark and deep as the forest, held a warmth that was more powerful than any flame. They didn't need words. They had stood together against the world, and they had won. In the quiet of their mountain sanctuary, under the watchful eyes of the pines, they had forged a bond stronger than steel, a love that was as wild and as resilient as the land itself. The town below could keep its whispers and its hate. Up here, on the ridge, they had something far more valuable. They had each other. Some stories don't end with wedding bells or a tidy resolution. They end with a choice to stand, a choice to fight, a choice to find your home in the most unexpected of places. Willa and Chessa's story is a reminder that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet, unyielding presence. Sometimes the most powerful love isn't spoken in vows, but in the silent promise to face the storm together. If you enjoyed this story of courage, resilience, and a love that defied all odds, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You never know what hidden stories we'll uncover next.